I get a lot of questions, and I got it at dinner the other night, so I thought I would get into it. I recently joined the company about 8 months ago, but I've been in the technology space around construction for the past almost 20 years. And people say, Leica, where have I heard of you guys before? And they say, oh yes, can you help me get a camera? And I would say that's not us. The companies are related many years ago, but so it's the same logo or similar logo with the same script. That's not us, but you may have seen us beside the road. We have been long in this market in the surveying business, surveying total stations. So, but we are really making a push now into the building construction market, and that's why I'm here. That's really the point of engaging here, and I'm hoping to introduce you to us and talk a little bit about how we might help you and how you might help yourself shape smart change. We're a part of a company called Hexagon, which is a multinational conglomerate out of Europe. We have about 18,000 employees across 50 countries, so it's quite a sizable company. Some of you have much bigger organizations, I think, but a sizable company. Our revenues are about 3 billion euros, or about 4.6 I calculated last night, Australian dollars. And so we're a company that's been growing over time, and we have a number of business lines that you may or may not be aware of. So just really trying to give a brief introduction to us. I'm a part of the Geosystems business, which is the third one over from the left there on the top row. We have a sister company that you, especially if you've been working in the plant space, would have done business with before. It was until recently called Intergraph PPM, or Intergraph is now called Hexagon PPM, Power Plant Marine. But we have a wide range of solutions across the businesses, and again, I'm part of the Geosystems business. So Hexagon Geosystems is globally one of the top leaders in geospatial information technology of all sorts. We do have in this business about 4,500 of those employees. You notice we're a pretty significant part of Hexagon's overall revenue at about a 1.1 billion. This does include our mining business as well, and have been on a nice growth pattern over the years. And part of our business, of course, I mentioned in the beginning, is the surveying business, and we've been really focusing on how we transform in that business, how we go from really what you might have thought of as a traditional theodolite or total station, that sort of thing, to really high definition surveying from all sorts of means, including airborne and terrestrial and other types of scanning services. We have a significant and growing business in the building construction market, particularly in North America and in Europe. So when you like rotating lasers is one of the areas. We have small measuring devices, distos, and a line of total stations and software that we'll talk about in a minute that is also unique to building construction. We are in the heavy construction business, so machine control as well. And really one of the most exciting things for me is the opportunity to get involved in some of the disruptions in the building market and to engage with the customer set that I've been working with my whole career around the building construction market there. We have other companies like Multivista is a sister company that does construction documentation and captures reality in different ways through a set of services. And I mentioned one of our sister companies, PPM, has, you may start hearing about things like Hexagon Smart Build, which is a little bit of a building-oriented product as well. So that's enough about us. We are partnered, Leica Geosystems is partnered in Australia with C.R. Kennedy. And really the team that I would point you to here locally is on the right here, so the team from C.R. Kennedy. So I would encourage you to, if you have interest in talking to Leica Geosystems, then please talk with C.R. Kennedy. They're our reseller here locally. So what's the challenge we're talking about? What's the need for smart change, and what's the challenge particular to the Australian market? I've tended to look, especially since I lead the North American business, at the particular challenges of the North American market. So in prepping up for this talk, I got a little bit of a study into the economics of your market down here. It was interesting, just in North America, I'll talk about that market a bit. The building construction business is going full steam. We are, Tyler talked about the amount of backlog they have. Most builders that you talk to in the US are so covered up with work they don't know what to do with themselves. And the challenge, of course, is around finding enough labor to do that, and we'll talk about that a bit. I found some confusing notes on the Australian market. So one of the reports showed real concerns about the residential high-rise market. But others, it really starts to show that, it's not gangbusters like maybe it is in the States in terms of the growth patterns, but we were coming off a pretty bad several years, so we have a lot of backlog of demand there. But it looks like you're growing, and you're growing consistently. And looking around Melbourne, at least, I noticed a number of cranes in the sky, and it seems like quite a healthy building market here moving forward. So that's what we're looking at. But we've all seen these graphs. I've seen this one presented a couple different ways this week, in fact, in terms of the productivity in construction, the reliability of the predictability of construction. Also, Tyler mentioned. And this is not just the first time this graph got produced, it was only about the States. Paul Tychels had studied this a couple different times in 2003 and 13 again, had studied this again. And then it was looked at across the mature economies. And it seems to be a pretty consistent theme across these economies that we're not getting the levels of increase in productivity that we get in other industries. And then this 80-20 rule usually is 80% of the progress, 20% of the work to get 80% of the progress, what have you. This is, again, back to the point of 80% of our major capital projects, at least according to the reports we've seen, tend to go over budget. I know we're suffering from that in the Southeast US and a couple of nukes that are now getting shut back down because they were so far over budget. And they tend to run at least 20% over time. As well. And we know that, and I'm just going to say maybe we do have a problem in this industry in terms of how we approach things in the field. We know it's hazardous to the people. It can be. We've made great progress over the last 20, 30 years in terms of bringing that hazard level down. But I think maybe even, I won't say more concerning, is it's hazardous to the health of the organizations that are involved in this business. This study I saw pulled some data from BizMiner. It's from the Surety Information Office, which I believe is a U.S. entity, showed that over the 2011, 2012, 2013, not a bad time to be in construction. The failure rate was between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 construction, not just firms, offices, whether they were larger firms, smaller firms. They're a really high failure rate in the business. And the question is, why is that? So maybe we do need to think about shaping a smarter process. The World Economic Forum with Boston Consulting Group has done some studies of what they believe are the megatrends facing the industry, and I don't want to go into all that. It's an interesting report. I encourage you to download it, read it. I think it's freely available. But a few things I would point out. I've seen it with the projects that have been presented here. Larger, more complex projects certainly are part of the norm in this business. I'm going to go ahead and start my timer here. All right. So norm in this business, and it's getting more and more so. So the really impressive project you talked about up there in Brisbane. Resource scarcity, we're the #1 consumer of raw goods, and I'm going to add to that the labor scarcity. So in spite of the fact that maybe we're not growing in some markets as fast as others are, how many of you are concerned about where you're going to get your skilled workers in 5 years? Nobody concerned about that? In the US, you ask that question, about 85% of the hands are going to go in the air. 4 or 5 years ago, would have gotten the same kind of response. So I'd say something to watch is, where are we going to get the resources to actually build that next generation of projects? And that's right here in the aging workforce. About 50% of general contract, actually the number this year was like 72% of GCs were concerned about that. And I was talking to one of the major contractors in the States that was tracking their average workforce age, and they said it was going up by 1 year every year. Houston, we have a problem. Actually, that sounds bad these days because Houston does have a problem. They're covered in water, but we have a problem. I mean, if that's going up, so at that rate, because they also said they analyzed and they saw that 50% of their workforce, of their skilled engineering and their skilled trade workforce, would be retiring in the next 5 to 10 years, right? So they were looking at a cliff of what's going to happen with their workforce. So, so the question is, how do we do this better? And this is where, after listening to the presentations yesterday, I was up at 2 a.m. with jet lag and a little existential challenge to myself here. Because I come at this, I'm a technology vendor. I've been doing this for a long time. I left industry in the late 90s. That was the last time I was actually working on a construction project directly. So that's my ivory tower right there that I get to be in. And the question I was asking myself is, what do I bring to this discussion as someone who's kind of been working around an ivory tower around the world? So I don't think we introduced it, but I spent the last 10 years of my career with Autodesk. The last 5 of that was in a strategy role globally for Autodesk in the construction business. And so in doing that, so last night about 2:30 in the morning, I started thinking, well, what do I bring to this? And I went and had this app search my Google Photos store to see where have I been? So over the last 5 or so years, I've spent a lot of time moving around the world, and anything outside the States and a lot of what's in the States was all on business trips going to talk to construction contractors around the world. And so I was reflecting on this last several years of experience and talking to industry groups and contractors and that sort of thing around the world. I apologize, it was 2010 before I had Google Photos that I was last here, so many apologies there. And what I'll say is, in the UK, of course, we know about BIM Level 2, and there's been one approach there of kind of a top-down influence of the government to say that it's an owner pull of deliverables of what they expect from construction contractors. They have a vision for what they're going to get out of BIM. And hopefully everybody's familiar with what they're doing. In Central Europe, there's a group called the 5D Initiative that's several German contractors that have been working together, and I was engaged with them for years. They had a very different approach where they were specifying in great detail exactly what they wanted from every step along the way, and planning what was going to happen. So interesting effort, but and that was another approach is in terms of really planning out the workflow and process that was going to happen with BIM. And some progress got made. I think some of the companies in that group have innovated a little faster than maybe the group was able to innovate. And then there's the United States. And it's not just because I'm a Texan by birth. We have quite a cowboy culture of little bits of innovation. You've seen what some of the different folks are doing in the States. And some heroics as well. But we tend not to have this organized way of going about saying, okay, what are some very specific things that we can accomplish to move the industry forward? We have people showing off their how they're putting a VR helmet on and showing off how they do, this and showing, and it prides everybody forward. But it's definitely a cat herding exercise. I couldn't find a good cartoon on that. So what I'll say to you, reflecting on my observations around the world and what I've seen from the group yesterday and what I saw from the way we've done the specification here for what we're going to, as mechanical contractors, what we want to. Not just mechanical, MEP, we have E as well. What we want to accomplish here, I think you're doing pretty well in terms of trying to really accomplish a business result. And I applaud that. So hopefully you'll continue those efforts forward. Now back to Hexagon and the shaping smart change and shaping a smarter building process. Our corporate slogan is shaping smart change. And I really like the way that we are thinking about this in terms of just the shape of things and how we're really trying to, not only with the geomatics and not only with the scanning and with the other ways of, and the metrology businesses and that sort of thing, the other ways of actually measuring things, we're actually thinking about how do we put the physical and the digital together and the intellectual resources to really help move the folks forward around the shape of things to come. And I wanted to kind of incorporate that into how maybe we can shape a smarter building process. And I recognize that unlike maybe some other industries, the chip making business or the ship making business, even in the car making business, you guys work in a very chaotic environment. This is in Hong Kong. I was walking past a metro project there in Hong Kong and snapped this picture because it really spoke to me from my ivory tower of what, how I tend to oversimplify maybe some of the projects or some of the problems that you're working on out there in the field. You guys work in a pretty complex environment. So how might we go about, what does a smarter building process look like? Is it bricklaying robots? I've heard a lot of angst amongst folks that might be in the masonry business about what this bricklaying, you've all seen this, right? Everybody seen this? Okay. So I know the guys that have this company, and their vision is not really that they're going to replace the mason. They're augmenting masons, because it turns out that robots are really good at picking up bricks and buttering them and sticking them up there. They're not really good right now, at least, at making it look good, of striking. But the masons are really, really good at that. But remember the aging workforce? Remember how we're going up by 1 year every year? Well, picking up unit masonry, and not just bricks, but bigger blocks and the other size, that really wears people out over time. So how can we start to bring technologies to bear to augment these workers, to extend careers, to make it actually let them do the art and not just the backbreaking work of moving bricks? And maybe you are eliminating some of the lower cost employees that are just bringing bricks to the guy to put on the wall. So I think that's one of the interesting ways. Maybe that's a smarter, a new shape, a smarter shape of construction. I went to Dubai, it was a year and a half ago, and right before I went to go there, Sheikh Mohammed announced that we're going to 3D print 25% of our office buildings by 2030. Now, the project I had earlier was in Dubai. And how many of you have worked in the Middle East in Dubai? Okay, a little bit of a chaotic work environment actually out in the field, right? I mean, I went inside a project I won't name because one of you may have worked on it there, but it was a large civic project there, and I could not believe the cables that were everywhere and the scaffolding that was willy-nilly and all this. I thought, how on earth are they going to go from this chaotic, messy, really low-skilled, workforce construction process to 3D printing 25% of their buildings by 2030. But the week I was there, they did evidently 3D print their first office building. That's what they said, it was the world's first 3D printed office building. And so a little bit of progress there. Maybe 3D printing is and I think it is part of a smarter building process and can take some of it out. But all of these are evidenced by this trend toward digitization or digitalization. One time spent 3 hours in a debate over the syllables, so we'll just go with digitalization. In construction, and the question I think we have for ourselves, what does that mean to us, and how do we enact these things, and why, and how fast can we move in that way? So after a year or so of talking about digitization and digitalization, I decided I would look up a definition, and I found one on the web. I'll read it to you because it's more fun to read this one. Digitalization is the integration of digital technologies into everyday life by the digitization of everything that can be digitized. I did not make it up. You can Google it. I couldn't make that up. So that was, yeah. So I like this one better from Gartner, which really talks about the two pieces of your changing your business models. We've heard about that from a number of the people in this conversation. I think I would really challenge you to think about your business model and what does this mean to your business model? How do you add new value for your customers? How do you add new value for your stakeholders? That's really what I think keeps me up at night and what I hope will be keeping you up at night moving forward, not just jet lag. McKinsey, we saw a little flash of this. I think it was in Frank's presentation yesterday. Did a report on the digital index they came up with for various industries. And it goes from IT all the way down through oil and gas. So oil and gas is pretty high. Mining is actually pretty high in terms of their use of information, of big data to plan things out. If you keep going and going and going and going down, you'll find construction right here at the bottom. I hope you find it down toward the bottom, right above agriculture and farming. And thank goodness for, agriculture and hunting, and thank goodness for the hunters. Because I think if you took hunting out of this equation, we'd probably find that ag is ahead of construction in the use of things like artificial intelligence, big data, analytics, sensors, to determine, to really make decisions about the best way to apply resources. In fact, I can tell you they tend to be well ahead of construction in this area, at least in developed economies. Other parts of the world, not so much. So thank goodness for the hunters, because they're keeping us out of last place. And if we really drill in on this a little bit about what they're talking about, It's things like how are transactions formed? How are markets made? Those are challenges to the core way the way we do business. I mean, I don't know what it looks like here, but I know in the States there's a bid process that goes on to come up with a price, and then there's kind of what happens after the bid to really come up to find fee or to find margin in those to bring the subcontract prices down a little bit more after we've established that, so that we can find a bit of fee in there. It never happens, right, Tyler?
No.
All right. Oh, never. Okay. But a digital market would kind of take that out. It would kind of perfect that, really to the benefit of whom? I think the owner, in the end. There. So, what are the different processes that go on in terms of digitalization? We see some evidence of that in various ways. We know we have smart cities, smart roads. We have the use of drones. How many people are using drones in their workflows here now? 3 or 4? I think everybody in the States claims to, now that you can get a pilot's license. I'm not sure how many of them they hold on to or how many they put into the drink. But there's a lot of innovation going on in that area. We saw the bricklaying robot or the assistant robot. Big data analytics. I know I've seen a number of you with some presentations that look to head that way. But then how do we get away from deterministic reporting of information and letting the computer start to find patterns and help us make decisions? And then things like 3D printing, which is going to really, I think, over time go away from making little plastic things to making housing and other things in a way that's far more efficient than we can do today. McKinsey, and apologies, the second time you've seen this graph this week, McKinsey mentioned 5 trends that'll help get started on that way. Higher definition surveying and geolocation. If we're going to start to bring the digital and physical together, we have to do that in a way that really helps them marry up in a precise way. So that's one of the reasons they're starting here with this aspect of it. It's one of the things that excited me about the move to a geosystems business is how do I really start to connect the digital and physical and get out of my ivory tower and get my boots dirty again. Next generation 5D BIM, I would posit that a lot of what we're doing here around the world in terms of BIM is really still 3D in terms of, I know we've said we don't like Clash, but I still hear a lot of people talk about that as the value they get out of BIM, and no doubt there's value in finding issues before they get in the field. But how do we really connect this together into an end-to-end supply chain-led manufacturing type process the way we might do in another business? Digital collaboration and mobility, there's fantastic tools out there, and this is an area that has had huge uptake in the last few years. When the iPad first came out, I would go talk to customers that when we were saying, well, maybe we should put something on the iPad. We ended up buying a company that was in that area, and a number of customers said, I would never use that on a construction site. What if it gets broken? And I think now most of us say, so what if it gets broken? We'll get another one, right? It's not that expensive an asset. So really connecting the people in the field. I heard one of the last speakers talk about their iForms that they were using out there in the field, which is, I think, a fantastic way of trying to capture the information right there at the point of construction. Internet of Things, advanced analytics, you're going to see a whole lot going on in the next few years in that area. And then also, what are the future-proof, what are the new materials that can come on? I've met with a few cement conglomerates, a couple of those around the world, and there's a whole lot of effort going into new types of materials that will be far more resilient, far more able to handle the stresses of the environment, and possibly even contribute a little less to the destruction of the environment over the years. But before we strap on our whole bunch of sensors and start heading out there in the world and capturing that, what I want to do, and this is the kind of the core of the talk, is talk a little bit about then what are the elements of digital transformation? If we're going to shape a smarter building process, how do we get really started on that? And what do we need to worry about? And I looked at a number of different frameworks from the different consultancies. This showed up in a blog from somebody called the Enterprisers Project, which I don't know a lot about, but what I liked was the way they kind of boiled it down and started with the customer experience. Right, so if we are going into digital transformation, and I heard it yesterday with a couple of talks, if we're going into this digital transformation and not putting our customer experience first, I think we're missing the point, because somebody out there is, and they're going to be the ones that succeed. How do you start pivoting that into operational agility? We'll talk about that in a moment. Culture and leadership is an absolute must. When I hear people that are trying to get a digital transformation movement going and they have no support of their leadership, they're sunk. How do you enable your workforce? In the construction, that is such a critical link when 90% of the money spent in construction actually spent with a workforce out in the field or back in the factory. And then there's the digital technology integration. So much of us that are kind of digerati or are into the technology want to start with the tech and then go apply it. Well, what do we do? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the customer experience. What do we in construction today, if we're honest with ourselves, what is the experience we give to the customer at the end of the project? How do we bury them in paper through the project? We dump it off at the last moment and run away. Whether we're handing them a model or handing them a stack of paper, we're just really handing them a pile of junk on the way out the door, and that they never use again. And I heard it everywhere I go. I hear this conversation. Yeah, we give it to the owner, but they never touch it again. I think it's true of blueprints, it's true of many Kobe files and that sort of thing. I was really encouraged to see the data center project a few minutes ago and to hear the customer really leading that charge of how they're going to integrate that into what they do. So maybe there's a different customer experience we want to give, where there's the end of the project or the beginning of the project and how they start to experience what they're going to get. Operational agility, I think, is maybe one of the biggest tripping points that's going to come up here in construction, because this right here it looks like a noodle, a whole bunch of noodles, but this is your workflow. Whenever I go out and talk to various construction firms around, whether they're main contractors or whether they're subcontractors, and they start showing their operation manuals or start drawing on the board what we do, that's one project, right? And it's a kind of a nest of spaghetti. And then what about project B? Because we're a whole bunch of heroes, we're a bunch of cowboys, and we don't really want to tell people how to make money for us, because as long as they're turning in the appropriate fee with some change order, we're happy, right? So we're not going to go change the process because it might break it. So there's project 2, project 3, project 4, and this is really kind of what, in my view, operations of most construction firms look like. So how do we start to make this a process that starts today and goes to B and really gets rid of a lot of the fluff that goes around that? At that point, we can start to repeat that across projects and have something we can get flow out of. Culture and leadership, absolutely important. I can't stress enough how important it is that you get top-down sponsorship and support from in your firms. I engage with a lot of folks and have over the last 10 years that are kind of the young guns and go out there doing stuff and they're thinking technology first. Then they wonder why it fails. Well, it fails because A, they are not thinking about the customer, they're not thinking about how it fits into their operations, they're not thinking about all these aspects, but at the same time, probably most importantly, they're not getting top-down sponsorship or top-down support for digital transformation. When from the top is saying we will lead in these areas, we get transformation, and then people understand how to what target they're moving forward. I would say I would not do say you need to have a top-down plan for you're going to do this and you're going to do that, and that's a way to get slow. But top-down support for the need to transform, the need to be able to fail fast forward is absolutely critical. And then workforce enablement. And when it gets to construction, we have even if you're a main contractor and you say, well, I have 2,500 employees, but I don't self-perform anything. Well, in reality, you have maybe 100,000 employees that you're working with, because you are needing to enable that workforce that's all your subcontractors as well. So this is a look at what Fails Management Institute, or FMI, is projecting for growth in the construction market in the States moving forward. Just pointing out that not yet in real terms have we gotten back to the peak of 2007. That's the point of this. Yet, if you look at the number of employees involved in construction, we are far short of that, right? So we were close to the peak in real terms of output, but we're far short of the number of employees. So we have this gap of, if we're going to keep growing the way they're projecting, how are we going to then do more with less? And again, it has to do with enabling your workforce to take advantage of the digital and connect that out to the dirty work that they do out there in the physical world. And then it gets down to integrating technology, and that's always the fun part, and that's what we all get excited about. But at this point is where we start integrating technologies. And this is back to another McKinsey report and they analyzed recently. This came out in July. So the size of the bubbles is the number of companies or the technology offerings involved in different areas. And tragically, the biggest number of them is in things like ERP, kind of the back of house stuff that does not really transform our business. It just keeps up with where things are and keeping up with equipment. This report is called The New Age of Engineering and Construction Technology. Encouragingly, however, in terms of the ones that have come on in the last 5 years, the new startups, they show the bigger bubbles here are starting to show up in things like on-site execution, quality control, safety, materials, the kind of things that happen on the construction side and really start to impact the way we do our work. So I'm encouraged by that. There's an interesting company called CB Insights that has been tracking a map of the various startups in the construction business. And if you sign up to get daily emails from them, then you can get to this graph. And I just found it really fascinating to see the number of startups that have gone into the business and the amount of money that's been poured in from venture capital over the last few years. And we'll see some gains out of this. We'll also see some fantastic fizzles. We don't know which ones they are yet. So if you're thinking about all this, many of you, as you've listened to some of the presentations yesterday, and you're thinking about this idea of digital transformation, you may feel like this dog drinking out of the fire hydrant here. Just what do I do? How do I get started? Or you may feel like the dog over there that's enjoying the spray coming from the guy that is trying to drink out of the fire hose. That's kind of a fun place to be sometimes too. But how do you get started? Let's go back to the first three that McKinsey put out there. This idea of higher def survey and geolocation, reality capture and positioning. That's it's no secret that's our core business. This idea of really connecting the BIM processes to your work, to your supply chain, to the way you cost projects, the way you plan projects, the way you procure projects. I mean, there's so much to be done there in that area. And then obviously there's a wide range of specialized and general field and mobility solutions. But still, I think have this gap then between, how many of you are really office folks? You're doing the BIM planning, you're doing the project. How many of you are field people out there actually running field forces? One. Okay. That's the gap that I think that we need to work on here because again, 85-90% of what we spend in construction goes on outside the office. So we may have had a couple different strategies at play that have created a gap between the office world, maybe the ivory towers that maybe all of us are living in, and the dirty boots real world. One thing I would say, relentlessly simplify what you're trying to go after. We heard that earlier in the last presentation. That's one of the key things that we were trying to accomplish with the partnership with Autodesk is, how can we take something that really has taken a trained, specialized person, almost a specialized surveyor, and make it the kind of thing that is almost push button easy, where even I, who knows nothing about scanning, could scan. So relentlessly simplify. Here's some great shots that were taken from Australia with one of the ones that's in market down here. And then what I loved seeing is the first customer that posted anything on YouTube coming out of when they started getting the BOKs delivered in the States was this Maxwell Construction out of Indiana. I had to go look them up because I'd never heard of these guys. They're about a $25 million company. Started in 1988. They have and they're building things like La Rosa's Pizzeria. Small projects like this, the kind of things you would never have probably thought to apply 3D scanning to, and they said, well, we're going to start getting out there and scanning the underground, plumbing works to make sure that things are in the right place here. The same way, 3 or 4 years ago, I was seeing people in billion-dollar hospitals do laser scanning and compare it to the model. So I love seeing that. I would say relentlessly connect with the people in the field, however you're doing it. But let's start pushing the technology to the people in the field. Let's make it easy for them. Let's really let them take advantage of all this this perfectly, wonderfully coordinated model. Usually gets printed on paper and then processed through people's heads and then the tape measures to get things laid out in the field. So there's multiple paths to do that. If you're on IFC, there's paths there. If you're using BIM 360 as your hub, like one of them was, there's paths there. So we're not the only game in town, but let's connect this stuff with the field. Let's really start to enable the people out there on the work site to use technology to do their jobs better. Here's an example out of Canada, a company called Clark Builders that was the guy that presented this presentation at our customer conference this year. Started out as a carpenter foreman. He became the head layout guy, but he's not a technologist. He just wanted to do his job better. And so he had this parking deck that was a pretty complex structure because it not only did it have the drainage that was required and that sort of thing, but they managed to specify that all of the slabs had to be equal thickness. No concrete, you couldn't have flat pan on the bottom. Everything had to be equal thickness. So he had to figure out how to lay this thing out. And so the first thing he did was he said, okay, well, I'll just make a surface out of it. I'll make a tin out of it, and I'll go out and I'll use a dipstick and I'll start figuring out how to do this. And they realized that that was just an approximation and they didn't think they could get within tolerance. Then he said, well, what if I made a model in Revit and then brought it out into the field, into the tablet and did that? And then he started, what I loved about this guy was, he could have stopped there. Then he said, wait a minute, what else could I do that would be really complex, even more complex than this? So he started making he just started playing in Revit, making spirals and cants and showing that he could bring that out into the field and he could lay out anything, no matter how complex a form he made, he could go lay that out in the field reliably. And so what I loved about that was it's a workforce enablement discussion. It's not really a technology discussion. We have a guy that, he's got a scraggly beard, tattoos, all this, and he's out there figuring out how to do it for himself. Why wasn't somebody, helping him get to that sooner? And then the question, for all of us here is this idea of pushing it to the field, of getting it simple, getting out there is why now? And it's back to the same discussion I think a few of us have talked about. And the why now of it is I like this quote from John Chambers. He said, and this is from 2015 or 2015 at his user conference, he said 40% of the businesses are going to die in the next 10 years. They just are. If they don't figure out how to change their entire company to accommodate new technologies. So I guess my challenge to you, and I hope you're listening to the other speakers that have come here this week, is that I would keep pushing forward now. Start to make this transformation. Start to think of what does it mean to your business model, your customer relationships, to become more digitized as you move forward. So thanks.